Hey, my name's Matt Kennedy, and this is the Steadfast Podcast. This podcast exists to use Bible study and theological teaching to encourage you to be steadfast in your faith. Thank you for taking time out of your day to check out the Steadfast Podcast. I hope today's episode is an encouragement to you. On last week's episode of the Steadfast Podcast, we talked about a couple key words in the passage. We're going to pick up today with our journey through the 17th chapter of Luke. Today we're going to see a particular group of people who were in great need. We're going to see how Jesus treated them, how he interacted with them, and how their lives looked different forever as a result of that. Let's get right into our first point of the day, and that is Jesus brings hope to the hopeless. Jesus brings hope to the hopeless. Starting in verses 11 and 12, quote, "On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance." End quote. Now, we haven't got a location on Jesus in several chapters. Recently, the chapters have been filled with his teaching, whether that teaching was directed at the Pharisees, at his disciples, at sinners and tax collectors, whoever it was focused on teaching. Today, we do get a location on Jesus. We get his travel itinerary, if you will. He's passing between Samaria and Galilee on his way to Jerusalem. I mentioned it way back in our introduction to the book of Luke, and I've tried to point it out along the way. But Luke, who was a Gentile, he highlighted the Gentiles in his gospel account. So scholars tell us the area that Jesus is traveling through in this time is heavy on the Gentile side. So in this area, there are a lot of Gentiles living in Jewish lands, and Gentiles were considered outsiders. And that's not to mention the super specific group of outsiders known as the Samaritans. True outsiders in the Jewish world, people who are hated and looked down upon. They're going to come up again soon, so hold that thought. But despite all of this, while many people would have found another way to Jerusalem, it did not stop Jesus. He was going to travel through this area no matter who was there, maybe especially because who was there. While Jesus is traveling through the lands of some outsiders, he was met from a distance, the outsiders of outsiders, a group of 10 lepers. I think most of these men were probably Jews. Definitely not all of them, but probably most of them. And they were Jews living in a Gentile region. Maybe that was not even their choice. It's really tough for us to understand what it's like to be a leper. Today, it's super rare. And there are treatments for it so it doesn't get too bad. But back then, there were no treatments. It would cause horrible disfiguration of one's appearance. Your face, your whole body would look totally different. And really, as the disease advanced, the person could almost look different from being human, maybe even less than human. Of course, they're still made in the image of God, so they're not less than human, but the appearance could make people think such things. They thought it was super contagious. So lepers, under the penalty of death, had to keep their distance from other people, as we see here in verse 12, because they stood at a distance. Now, can you imagine if every time you're around people, you had to raise your hands in the air and shout, "Unclean, unclean," just so everyone would know they need to keep their distance from you? My goodness, what a horrible thing. Can you imagine people gasping as they saw you, and not because you're good looking, but because you are unsightly? Or to hear people whispering things back and forth, knowing it's about you, and they're wondering what horrible thing you had to have done to deserve this disease. That was their mindset. They thought if you were a leper because you deserved it, that you had done the crime and now you're paying the time. So not only are you exiled, but your reputation is ripped to shreds. People might even deny knowing you. So for Jews, who I'm going to say are probably 90% of this 10-man leper team, the center of their world was the temple in Jerusalem and their local synagogues. That was their connection to God. A leper, since he wouldn't be allowed around people and definitely could not participate in the religious activities of the Jews, would not be able to go to such places. They would be cut off from their religion, cut off from their communities, talked horribly about behind their backs, and had to keep a distance from everyone. They're forced to live as outcasts without hope of life getting better. There are so many clear reasons why people were so afraid of this disease. It changed everything for the worse. If you were a leper, you just prayed for God himself to heal you. Now, I do believe that is something that happened. How often is impossible to say, but it happened often enough for God to put a whole chapter in the book of Leviticus about how healed lepers could be made ritually clean, how they could be brought back into the covenant community of God's people. So it definitely happened. It was definitely a thing that occurred. So here in these verses, there is this group of people who have heard of this Jesus who has healed people from all sorts of things. Could he bring the impossible into their lives? Could he bring the healing that they needed? And we're not just talking about physical healing at this juncture. We're talking about whole healing with all of their lives, all of their bodies, all of who they are. Let's pick up in verse 13 and 14. Quote, "And lifted up their voices, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, Go and show yourselves to the priest. And as they went, they were cleansed." End quote. These lepers have seen Jesus and call out to him from a distance, pleading for mercy. Apparently, they've heard about what he can do. Maybe they've heard about the miracles he's performed. In Jesus, they see a glimmer of hope in a dark, dark life. Jesus could have just said, hey, you're healed. But one thing about Jesus is that he was always careful to obey every part of the law. Now, he didn't care much for the rules that people made up about the law, the extra stuff that people wanted others to do, but he always respected the law itself. Because remember, the law itself was given by God to his people. It was a gift, right? So he was always respecting the law. The law prescribed people in such a situation, those who were struck with leprosy and then found healing, to show themselves to the priest. Jesus really valued God's word. He did not pick and choose what he wanted to follow. He was all in to the whole thing all the time. It is worth noting, I think, here that Jesus' healing of the lepers required a step of faith on their part. And when I say step of faith, it might be more literal in this instance than most. He told them to go show themselves to the priest. Now, the priest would have been upset if a whole bunch of lepers just showed up at his door all leprosy-y. They had to be cleansed along the way, and they were. The lepers could have said, that's it, as if it's some kind of like scam or if he's just trying to pull a fast one on them. And they could have just gone their own way, forgot all about Jesus. And if that's the case, I'm not sure healing would have happened. I'm not sure it would have been in their future. They obeyed the word of Jesus. They took steps toward the priest. They didn't get all the way there, and they found healing. By faith, they were healed. Jesus made time to be their healer, to give opportunity for their faith to flourish. What we see is the mercy of a Savior meeting the faith of a needy and a miracle happening. Look, remember in verse 11, we saw that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. Now, why is he going to Jerusalem? He's on a little mission to save the world from their sin, right? He's got big things ahead. You could say the biggest event in history is ahead of him. And it would be so easy when you have that big of a thing on the calendar to say, sorry, I'm too busy. I've got more important things to do. Listen, if anyone could have ever said, hey, I'm too busy, and it be true in the history of the world, it would be Jesus. He would have every right to say that. And yet, what we see screaming from the page is God's love for the outcast, the broken, the burdened, the overwhelmed, the alone, and these lepers could have fit in every one of those categories. You know, all of us, every last one of us are in one of those categories, maybe all of those categories at some point or another. At some point, we're all the outcasts. At some point, we're all broken. At some point, we're all burdened and overwhelmed and alone. Life is hard and it throws difficult things at us. Maybe we experience several of those things at the same time. We are all in need of God's grace and God's mercy every single day, just like the 10 lepers in this passage. I want you to marinate on this question. Think about how can God's love for these 10 lepers help us when we feel like we are the ones who are the outcasts or the ones carrying the heavy burdens, the one who feels so overwhelmed. Listen, we can remember our God is not too busy for us. He doesn't have a bigger fish on the other line, as senior citizens like to say. He is an infinite God who actually exists outside of time. There is no limit as to what he can handle. I know you've only got 24 hours in a day, and there is only so much you can cram in those 24 hours, but we worship and serve a God who's got infinite hours and infinite days, and it can all happen infinitely at the same time. He is that big and that incredible. incredible. But more than that, we see the heart of God seeking those who are hurting, seeking those who are downcast. Jesus could have traveled any way he wanted to. He could have gone the long way. He could have cut another shortcut. But we see he traveled a particular way so that he would be in the path of 10 lepers who needed him. We see God being the great healer, not just of our bodies, but of our hearts, of our minds, of our lives, as surely leprosy affected more than just physically when it came to the lepers. Our good God always has space for us at his table, and more than that, he actually wants us to take a seat at the table. There is no sense of obligation with our God. There is a sense of delight. There is a sense of enjoyment. There is a sense of he is pumped for his kids to join his table. So when you feel like the outcast, when you feel overwhelmed, when you feel heavy burdened, when you feel like life is too much, I want you to remember the heart of God towards you and people like you in that situation. He delights in showing you mercy. He delights in showing you love and grace. He delights in you having a seat at his table. And yet, one uncomfortable thing for us Christians is that we are called, as Ephesians 5 tells us, to be imitators of God as beloved children. Look, we are called to not just be those who receive grace, but those who are dealers of grace, those who are beacons of grace, those who freely give it out. So we have to consider both sides of this in our lives. We have to consider the grace we have received, but also the grace that we are called to give. So how can we imitate God's love for the outcast, for the overwhelmed, for the heavy burdened? Well, listen, we need to be praying that God would give us eyes to see the hurting around us. Usually we are so caught up with ourselves, with our own lives, as though the planets and the stars and the moons and whatever else is floating in space is orbiting around us. So much so that we can't see others. I mean, really see them. Are we paying attention to those who are around us? Are we looking for ways to help? Are we leaving enough margin in our schedules so that if a need actually does arise, that we have the time and the resources to help? We're entirely too busy and self-focused for our own good, and much more than that, we are too busy and self-focused for the good of anyone around us. Jesus made time. Jesus made space, and we are called to be such close followers of Jesus that if he were walking in front of us, we could feel the dust of his sandals. So if he is making time, if he is making space, then fellow believers, so should we. Remember, Jesus brings hope to the hopeless. Now, can you imagine what kind of moment this would have been like for the lepers? In a lot of ways, they're going from being dead men, total outcasts, and now they get to pursue normal lives, all because of Jesus. They were in many respects the walking dead, and now they are the epitome of life. Hope is filling them. Those who were hopeless are now hopeful. Those who were hopeless are now hopeful. Which brings us to the second point. We owe Jesus all of our praise and gratitude. We owe Jesus all of our praise and gratitude. Let's pick back up in verses 15 and 16. Quote, "Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan." End quote. God had done great things for the 10 lepers, yet it affected one of them in a way it did not affect the other 9. This one leper knew that God had changed his life, and he was so grateful. Who knows how many times he called out to God in prayer, hoping, wanting, longing for a miracle in his life. I can only imagine the countless nights, countless prayers, and perhaps even slipping hope. Yet look at what God had done. He knew that God had absolutely changed his life, saved his life, and all he could do was celebrate God. There was no look at me. There was no, now what do I want to do now? None of that. It was all, let me go praise my God. Let me go show my gratitude to the one who has changed my life forever. Now, Luke gives us a detail that this man was a Samaritan. Again, highlighting the outsider. Now, for many, that would have been a plot twist. One would think the most likely people to come and give thanks would have been the Jews of the crowd. I mean, let's think about this. They had the most opportunity to know about God. Surely the ones who had the most opportunity to know God would be the most grateful when God acts in a powerful way in their life. Surely they would be filled with praise for what God had done. But that's not what we see here. Now listen, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably in the group of people today that likely has as much opportunity to know the things of God as anyone ever. Not because you listen to this in particular, but if you're listening to this, I'm going to assume you probably have many sources of biblical teaching in your life. I'm going to guess that you have at least one full copy of God's Word. I'm going to guess that you either frequently or at least occasionally rotate through Bible teaching, whether that be listening to a podcast, watching sermons on YouTube, reading books, whatever it happens to be. I'm going to guess your pastor has the opportunity to draw from so many resources so easily to help him prepare to preach biblical sermons. We live in a golden age as far as how easy it is to get good and deep and quality information. Now, granted, there's a lot of trash content out there too, but I hope we, who have the privilege to know as much as we'd like, do not take that for granted like we see in this passage. I hope for us that God does not become a thing of academic study, but rather a good Father who we long to have a relationship with that affects every square inch of our life. Look at verse 17 through 19. Quote, "Then Jesus answered, 'Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?' And he said to him, 'Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well.'" End quote. It doesn't escape Jesus that 10 were cleansed and only 1 returned. I mean, Jesus is the smartest person ever walked the earth. As I've already suggested, the instructions that Jesus gives them to go show themselves to the priest would imply that most of the group would be Jewish, that most of, if not all, the 9 who did not return were Jews. Now, I'm going to make an assumption here. I'm going to assume that at least some of the other lepers who did not return to give thanks prayed just as much as the Samaritan did. I'm going to assume they wanted to be healed from leprosy just as much as the Samaritan did. I'm going to assume they spent time asking God for mercy and healing just as much as the Samaritan did, yet they didn't come back and give thanks. They were just as desperate and healed just as miraculously, yet they lacked the Samaritan's gratitude. They just went on with their lives. My goodness, don't we do this all the time? It's going to be easy to dunk on this group of people, right? But we need to look in the mirror and look at ourselves where we feel so desperate for something to happen in our lives, for God to do something. And then when that thing happens, we just move on to the next thing we want. We just keep going. We just update our prayer list to have something else that we are desperate for Him to do. We take the good gifts of God in our life for granted. We almost act as though God owed us that good thing. So now that He has finally given it to us, we're even, right? We deserved it after all. He just gave us what we deserved. We're even, Stephen. There's about 1,000,000 things wrong with that thinking, right? I think we forget that every gift comes into our life is purely an act of grace from God. We did not deserve it. It is grace in action. Though there have been things we've prayed for and God has answered, God did not owe us a single one of those things. They are gifts of grace, every last one of them. But we live so fast. We move so fast through life from one thing to the next thing that we forget what He's done. There's a really good reason that God kept reminding His people to remember how He delivered them from Egypt, or how He miraculously stopped the waters of the Jordan River for them to pass. We got to slow down. We got to make time to be grateful, to take note each day of the good things He has done in our life. We've got to slow down. Here's my advice to you. Make a list of gratitude, a list of praise. I know you've got a prayer list, things you want God to do. Now make a praise list where you're giving thanks of what He's already done. List them out. Keep track of them. Make note of what you've prayed for and what happened in that situation. You're going to see God has been far more generous to you than you've realized. You are going to see that you've got far more reason to be grateful than you ever could have imagined. Please notice the grateful former leper's gratitude brought him closer to his God. The same will happen for you. I know you're busy. I know you got a lot on your plate, and sometimes it's overwhelming. The burdens feel heavy. But if you don't have time to be grateful before your God, then you've got to rearrange your schedule ASAP, as soon as possible. You want to be less stressed. Then how about spend more time remembering the times God has come through for you? Do you want to be less anxious? Then how about you spend time marinating on the ways that God has been good in your life, the prayers that He has answered. In truth, we owe Jesus all of our praise and all of our gratitude because all the good things come from Him. I'm going to stop talking right now because you have homework to do. If you're driving, I will allow for you to not be driving before you start doing this, okay? But when you stop driving, you need to start making a list of ways that God has been good to you. A list of prayers God has answered, a list of blessings that you may not have even asked for, and He just put into your life because He is generous and gracious and awesome. List out the ways that God has been good, and do not stop until you hit 40. That doesn't mean you have to stop at 40. I'm saying minimum 40. There are 40, I promise you. Listen to 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 34. Quote, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever." Thanks for listening to the Steadfast Podcast. I want to remind you that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, Paul wrote this, quote, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." End quote. So in light of biblical truth, let us be steadfast, immovable. Let us remember that through Jesus, not one labor is in vain, not one trial is in vain, not one effort in all of our lives is in vain. Because He gives purpose, and that purpose rings through eternity. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget, if you've got questions you would like answered, you can email me at matt@steadfastpodcast.com.